I'm struck by the tendency among pundits, parents, and presidents. How's that for an alliteration off the cuff, right? To cast doubt on the value of this kind of education, not because liberal education doesn't deserve criticism or skepticism even. It always has aroused that, and I'll talk about that this evening. But I'm surprised because some of those pundits, in fact most of them, and certainly our president, and more than a few of the parents, have benefited from this education themselves. And that is a little different from the criticisms that were launched about a broad conceptual education over the last 200 years or so. So we just had a chat on camera as an interview before the talk, and I was asked about these questions and criticisms, and I can't help but think that President Obama's daughter, when she goes and visits colleges, has not yet gone to a school that might be called vocational. Neither did her parents. So you can play to the crowd and say, we don't need any more art historians. But you would never say to your kid, if you're President Obama, or a teacher, or a firefighter, or a lawyer, that no way should you learn about art history, honey, because it's going to ruin your life. You wouldn't say it. You might say it in front of a big crowd of people in a convention hall to get a laugh. Or if you're the governor of the state of Florida, you might say we shouldn't support people who want to study anthropology. But even that governor's kid, if he came home and said, the most incredible thing happened to me in school today. I actually learned in my class about an archaeological dig where they discovered a pattern of family life hitherto unknown in this region of Asia. And now I understand what I want to do for the next 3 years. I want to go there and learn about this form of life. I don't think that governor is going to say, no, that's not for you. You have to put aside your intellectual curiosity, put it in a bag, put it in the closet, and after you make a ton of money by following in my footsteps and placating other wealthy people, then maybe you can rent a film about archaeology. That wouldn't be said. But the governor of Florida or the president of the United States or every candidate that is critical of CNBC will say, hey, you're a firefighter, your kid shouldn't be excited about archaeology. You're a school teacher, your kid should actually want to be an investment banker, not make the mistake you did. You're ahead of school. All right, your kid can be ahead of school. They're pulling up the ladder after they've climbed up. They think other people's kids should go to a coding academy only. Last night I had dinner with 30 seniors at Wesleyan in my house, and they all left. That's a joke. Sometimes at Wesleyan, sometimes the students just say, we're not leaving until we get what we want. One of the students said to me, with some sarcasm, isn't it great that all these kids doing that? We have a coding academy at Wesleyan in the spring. A lot of people learn additional computer languages, or maybe perhaps the first time. And she said, isn't that great you have that? And these students, they get internships with fancy companies, cool digital media companies, because it's Wesleyan, you know. I detected, even I, a head of school who tries to be immune to irony. She said, well, I'm a computer science major. They asked me to teach the coding academy. Where's my internship? Where's my path? So for her, she's doing the broad conceptual education. She has a liberal education, but focused in a technical field. But is it more technical than an education in music? I don't think so. Or even art history. She wants to make sure that an education that is broad and contextual doesn't just get marketed as a quick way of earning money now, but perhaps not in the future. She wants people to acknowledge the value of the kind of education you all believe in and give your students. But the parents of your students, who had probably, many of them had this kind of education, are worried their students won't be able to afford, or the world won't reward. It's that worry I want to talk about for the next 40 minutes or so, and then take your questions. And we don't have to talk about the history I'm about to describe to you. We could talk about anything you want in terms of higher education. I can tell you all the admission secrets of the NESCAC if you want. I wish I knew them, but whatever you'd like to talk about. But I want to talk to you about, it's a historical account. Is it okay if I stand down here? Is it, it seems a little, there are four moments in this account, so you know where you are in the scheme of the lecture. The first is liberate. The second is animate. The third is cooperate. And the fourth is instigate. 4 moments. I thought of this. I don't read talks anymore. When I was a professor, I was supposed to read a talk at the Library of Congress. I had curated an exhibition on Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. It was a big moment in my life. And I was there. There were Supreme Court justices there. There were, the heads of the Library of Congress, and, big deal. I had come from California. I had my paper ready to read. 50 minutes. I had practiced it. I was ready to go. And as I was about to get up, just like right before the talk, the head of interpretive programs at the Library of Congress leaned over and said, "Remember, you have 24 minutes." I said, "What do you mean, remember?" You never told me. And it was right then. It was right about to go up there. And so I left the paper on my chair, because there's almost nothing worse than seeing somebody like, And of course, I knew more about the exhibition than anyone in the room, because no one had seen it yet. It was right before the opening. So I could really make it up, right? And and it was so much fun, and they all got up and cheered at the end, and I came back to I guess I was working at the Getty at that time. I came back and said, I'll never read a paper again. And I've modified that. Unless I'm wearing a cap and gown, then I pretend to read it, because people expect more formality. But I have these 4 beats, and I was about to give this talk in China, and I thought, I got it. I'm going to do 4 things, and I just came up with these 4, very poetic, right? It rhymes. And I was so proud of myself, and I went up to speak, and then I realized the interpreter, who was not going to rhyme. So I had like 400 people, and I was like, liberate, animate. And they're like, So there it is. But I use it in any case. Liberate. I'm going to focus on Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson and his ideas about liberal education. Ours will be the follies of enthusiasm. Jefferson wrote to my daughter tells me to say, frenemy, John Adams. Ours will be the follies of enthusiasm, but not of bigotry. He said this in regard to trying to create an educational institution. He thought at first a national university that would educate the talented group of students who had finished their secondary education in such a way as to promote open-ended inquiry and not focused training. Jefferson believed that the Harvard College model that was available to people at the time undermined the very purpose of education, because the Harvard College model insisted, Jefferson thought, that you know where you're going to end up when you start your process. So you start your college education saying, I am going to be a minister. I am going to be in commerce. I am going to be in the professions. Well, you wouldn't have been allowed, and Jefferson thought this undermined the very premise of education, because you couldn't possibly know the outcome of inquiry before the inquiry began, and education should be teaching you inquiry not by putting up a PowerPoint and saying, here's inquiry. It should be teaching you inquiry through the practice of inquiry. And you couldn't know whether you should be a minister or in the professions or in commerce until you were well engaged in the enterprise itself. Now, it would be tendentious of me to say that meant an open curriculum, much like Wesleyan's, because it didn't. But it did mean an openness to serendipity and openness to discovery that for Jefferson was the hallmark of the scientific mind, the scientific worldview. Jefferson was an Enlightenment man. He believed in the Enlightenment mostly through Scottish sources, but let me use Kant's definition. It works perfectly for Jefferson. Immanuel Kant said, Enlightenment is freedom from self-imposed immaturity. Not too shabby, right? He didn't have very many pithy sentences, I have to say. Kant didn't, and it's probably only a fragment of a sentence given the way Kant wrote. But that's pretty good. Freedom from self-imposed immaturity. It works in high school. It probably works from middle school on, once they learn what self-imposed is. And what Jefferson understood is that that meant self-reliance and autonomy. You had to think for yourself. And you learned to think for yourself by practicing inquiry. And in creating the University of Virginia, he wanted to develop a university that would not be beholden to the forces of religion. In fact, you wouldn't go to the University of Virginia to become a minister because he wouldn't allow their chapels on the grounds initially. Because you should always be able to discover that the premises with which you began are false. And if that resulted in your being kicked out, that was not going to work. So Jefferson's commitment to liberal education in this American grain had nothing to do with learning particular subjects. I am sure, as heads of school, you have heard yourself or faculty members say, I can't believe this person is graduating from your distinguished school without having learned, usually it's the subject that person teaches, right? Who Churchill was, what Shakespeare said, what Milton wrote, calculus, no foreign language, whatever the fill in the blank. This was not the version of liberal education he was inaugurating, and that I'm writing about in Beyond the University, which makes a great holiday gift, by the way. Jefferson wasn't writing in that mode because for him, you could study various things with open-ended inquiry as your model. You didn't have to study Greek. The professors at Yale in, I think it's 1844, if memory serves, it might not, but around then, when they did their report, they said, you needed classics because it was furniture of the mind, and you needed certain furniture in order to work with. Jefferson wasn't so sure that was true at all. You couldn't tell what furniture you needed until you were doing the inquiry. You probably needed math, yeah, but you wouldn't know what kind until you were in the middle of it. And then you would learn other skills. All of this was, of course, under the rubric of autonomy. I could have said independence, and then you would, of course, right? The author of the Declaration of Independence. Autonomy and freedom were the result of education. You could not be free from self-imposed tutelage without an education. You could not be free of tyranny without an education. If you weren't given an education, the people with power and money would rule over you. If you didn't have an education to stand on your own 2 feet, you would be dominated by bureaucrats whose major objective was to accomplish as little as possible, and by wealthy people whose major objective was to control the bureaucrats so as to protect their advantages through wealth. Oh, I've skipped to the end. Doesn't it sound familiar? You wouldn't want an educated citizenry if your major argument for why you should have the most powerful position in the world was, I would be the greatest at this. That's the denial of the autonomy of citizens under the guise of caressing them. And for Jefferson, he saw that coming. This is what would happen. This is what bureaucrats do. They reproduce themselves. They will create a government that does less and less except hire more and more of their own. And this is what rich people will do. They will want to make sure their kids get into your schools and into my school. They will want to make sure that they protect their advantages. This is what they will do, Jefferson said. And the only way to stop them from doing this is to educate as many people as possible about the dangers of such a culture and society. And that meant for Jefferson, you needed financial aid, what we would call financial aid. He said it somewhat differently. He said we have to rake the rubbish to find among the poor really talented people, because the rich will have idiots as children or lazy people with good genes, right? My wife hates when I say this, so don't watch this. They'll have people that never have to have challenges. They could have put all their money in an index fund and been just as successful. That was a joke, too. You guys are not in the mood for laughing. And if you don't do that, the culture will become a caricature of a republic, where domination through tradition, privilege, and bureaucracy are the order of the day. Education for Jefferson was the only antidote to tyranny. Now, I realize, now usually I give this talk to students, and by now they're really angry. You're such a good, polite group, and used to hanging out with privileged people probably because of your positions like mine. We ask for money, don't we? I mean, not like this, like what I'm doing. But by now, when I give this talk, people are sitting there just going, yeah, Jefferson, yeah, look at this, Jefferson. In Wesleyan, there's no course in which Thomas Jefferson is mentioned, I think. Oh, wait. Hypocrisy and Racism, 104. Right? I mean, that's what you know about, that's what your students know about Jefferson today, is Sally Hemings, is slavery, is racism, as they should. I'm a historian, so I'm allowed to say, I'm encouraged to say by my profession, well, we shouldn't judge a man by the standards of our time. But even by the standards of his time, he was known as a hypocrite, a racist, well, I don't have to go on. You can go see Hamilton, which was made by a Wesleyan graduate, just saying, directed by a Wesleyan graduate, too, just saying, and get all of that stuff. But I want to talk about Jefferson as freedom because he created an American paradigm of education as the thoroughfare for freedom that becomes the core of the civil rights discourse in the 19th century. Let me read you. I have one quote I don't want to get wrong. The other ones I get wrong, no. The other ones are shorter. But from 1829, David Walker, who's a free black living in New England, who wrote a tract called The Appeal. It was an appeal to slaves to kill their masters and claim their freedom, or do whatever they had to do to claim their freedom. He was a wanted man, as you would suspect, very badly wanted by the southern states. He was wanted dead or alive, preferably alive, so he could be tortured to death. And he sewed his clothes. He apparently died of tuberculosis. But he sewed his appeal into the clothes of sailors and travelers so as to try to instigate rebellion. So no slouch in the path to freedom. And Walker, in his appeal, takes on Jefferson. He says, Jefferson says black people can't learn to read. Jefferson says black people can't have an education. Jefferson is on the one hand, waxes sentimental about, oh, it's so hard being a slaveholder, we're going to get punished in heaven. But so Walker is very much anti-Jeffersonian, as much as you can be. But he completely takes on this notion of education as liberation. Here's what he says. I pray that the Lord may undeceive my ignorant brethren and permit them to throw away pretensions and seek after the substance of learning. This is what he wants for slaves about to get their freedom. And he goes on. I would crawl on my hands and knees through mud and mire to the feet of a learned man, where I would sit and humbly supplicate him to instill into me that which neither devils nor tyrants could remove, only with my life. Here's the quote. For colored people to acquire learning in this country makes tyrants quake and tremble on their sandy foundation. 1829. That's Jeffersonian rhetoric. For colored people to acquire learning in this country makes tyrants quake and tremble on their sandy foundation. The bare name of educating the colored people scares our cruel oppressors almost to death. Such powerful language, illegal, dangerous language, radical language, Jeffersonian language. Two, not only, of course. I'll give you one other example. And don't worry, some of you are thinking, God, he said 4 and he's only on 1. I will liberate you. I'm spending more time on liberation. It's a Wesleyan thing. But let me give you one other example, because it's such a good one, I think. Frederick Douglass. Many more of you will know about, than perhaps David Walker. Frederick Douglass, who I write about in this book, tells the story in his autobiography. As a slave boy, his mistress took him to Baltimore and taught him to read. And this was illegal in the South, to teach a black person to read. And when her husband came to visit, she said something like, this is where I'm paraphrasing, honey, come and look, Freddie's going to read from the Bible. Right? And so she takes out the Bible and she said, Freddie, read. And she starts reading. Frederick Douglass, little Freddie, starts reading. The master, Mr. Old, explodes in rage, sends Fred to the corner. He's yelling at his wife. He's outraged. Why? Because he says, reading will make him unfit for slavery. And this is what Douglass remembers. His entire life, this resounds in his head. He goes on, of course, one of the great orators of the time, he goes on to talk about how funny it was to have all these laws against teaching blacks to read in the South, because, after all, they also said blacks couldn't read. He said, last time I looked, he said, there were no laws against teaching cows to read, or pigs. Why do we need a law? Because reading will make you unfit for slavery. Education will liberate you. This was not the leisured notion of liberal arts that was so powerful in Europe at the same time. This is an American, not wholly different, but an American offshoot of that tradition that connected broad contextual inquiry with freedom, with action in the world. Not just with freedom as a form of leisure, but freedom as a mode of inquiry. Franklin, who hated all this highfalutin talk of universities, I have to give just one bend for Angus. He said, you know, what do they teach up there in Harvard? Everybody criticize Harvard. It's what we do if we're not there, right? Frank said, what do you learn up in Harvard? You learn how to walk out of a drawing room backwards. That's what you learn at those fancy places. But Franklin was not anti-intellectual by any stretch of the imagination, right? He just was anti-sophistication, or at least made a show of being anti-sophistication. And so for Franklin, inquiry also will set you free. All right, liberate. The second moment is animate. And here I'll spend less time, and I'll talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson goes to Harvard to talk at Phi Beta Kappa Day. And he talks, as you know, about self-reliance, about autonomy, like Jefferson, and the importance of getting out from under rote learning, which is a big theme in the 19th century. Getting out from under rote learning, like drills of memorization. And Emerson says, memorably, that the task of colleges is not to drill. The task of colleges is to set our souls aflame. And he, like Rousseau before him, really looked at the students in a college or university and thought, if you are finding yourself more focused, tame, and compliant, run for the hills. Get out of class. All it's doing to you is folding you into society, not allowing you to stand on your own feet. How could you do that? Emerson went on. He added to Jefferson's notion of autonomy this crucial idea of animation, that we as teachers and students make the world come alive. Jefferson thought, good Lockean fashion really, that we receive the world, we're confused by it, it's hard to figure it out, but through experience, more and more experience, and experiments, we understand more and more what's going on in the world. Emerson didn't quite believe that. He thought we come to understand the world because we make it understandable through our active imaginations. This also goes back to Kant. You can only know what the world you make. But for Emerson, it meant that when you go for education, authentic education, what should happen is not that you figure out how to divide the world into smaller and smaller units that you can then comprehend. What should happen is that the world is more expansive, more vivacious, more colorful. And that happens because you are introduced to ways of seeing and hearing and tasting that expose you to parts of the world that you would have just walked through blindly and dumbly and deafly before. Sorry. And I just had a conversation with my students about this yesterday, actually. I asked them if they believed in educated taste. I teach a course on philosophy in the movies. And we had just watched this great film, you probably know, Stella Dallas, a Barbara Stanwyck film. And we were reading contemporary feminist film criticism and contemporary race theory and Stanley Cavell, a philosopher who I much admire and who writes on film. And Cavell writes a lot about educating taste. And I asked the students, do you believe that? Does that sound just like snobism to you? And I expected that they would say something along those lines, that yeah, you know, people who claim to educate our taste are just a bunch of old people like you, Roth, who are telling us we should like Cavell, or we should like Barbara Stanwyck, but not some contemporary star. But they didn't say that. In fact, one of the students said that through her roommate, she discovered jazz. That was the example she gave. which she knew existed. She wasn't like she discovered it, like she didn't know it existed. She knew it existed, but it wasn't there for her. She never heard it. And so her world got a little bigger when suddenly there was jazz in it for her. That you meet someone, you fall in love with someone who's devoted to poetry. And you might start off by saying, oh yes, I really do like it. I really do like it. And you're thinking, oh God, why do we have to, And then suddenly, you have this moment where you say, oh my goodness, this is incredible. That this poetry is incredible. Or I don't have to eat hamburgers all the time. Whatever it is, suddenly the world is bigger. And educational institutions have this obligation, not just to give students the skill to dissect the world, to analyze the world, but they have this obligation to have students animate the world, to make it bigger for themselves. Because if they don't make it bigger for themselves, forces of commercialism will make it narrower and narrower for them, so that their lives shrink and shrink and shrink. Example, please. When you go to buy a book on Amazon, it will tell you that people like you, when you sign up for Pandora, I love it. I hear things I wouldn't have heard on my own that they think I will like and buy. Rather than walking across the hallway and seeing that somebody's, I don't know, at Wesleyan, someone is, listening to, it seems like it's nothing. You walk in, what are you doing? Oh, I'm listening to this piece. You don't hear anything. And it goes, it's John Cage. That's it. Spent a lot of time at Wesleyan. And you're like, what the, you're just you're a snob. You're pretending to like this stuff. But just like all of you have had this experience, let's say with food, you must have had this experience with food, where you think, oh, that's really just somebody's snobism. And then suddenly you taste something that just, you didn't know it tasted like things tasted that way. And your world is bigger. Schools have this obligation, I think, to make the world, to give the students the ability to make the world bigger, so that their imaginations are not slaves to the forces that would want to sell them things on a daily basis. This wasn't Emerson's chief worry. He was worried that religion would make their lives smaller, or tradition and religion would constrict their imagination. He was a little worried about commercialism, but it hadn't reached anything near, of course, where it is today. The third moment is cooperate. So we have liberate with Jefferson and Walker and Douglas, and we have animate with Emerson. Could add William James in here as a kind of hinge figure. William James talks about, and actually it's in a lecture to teachers, remarks to teachers, talks about driving through the countryside. You could imagine it right out here near Mohonk Mountain, that he was coming from Cambridge, and he was being driven. He's looking around, and there was all these clearings around, and he says, William James says, oh my goodness, the woods was so lovely, and now look at all of this, they're chopping down trees, they have fires to clear the ground. He was kind of revolted. And then the driver of the carriage turns around and says to him, isn't it great? There's nothing we can't do in this wilderness. We can make this our own. And James suddenly says to himself, his ways of seeing the world were as foreign to me as mine, had he seen me sitting happily in my little room in Cambridge, would be to him. If he saw me sitting very happily looking at my iPad, in my book in Cambridge, he would say, oh, poor soul, he's locked away. And I, sophisticated professor, thinker, writer, I am as blind to his way of life as he is to mine. It's not alive to me. And James said in his remarks to teacher, what you have to do as a teacher is overcome a certain blindness. That was his phrase, overcome a certain blindness. And I'm sure you all see it as teachers, right? It's not just prejudice, it's just being blind to a part of the world that's not alive for you. And James, as you know, is a pragmatist. If anybody's a pragmatist, James is a pragmatist. And so he thought there was cash value, as he put it infelicitously, to that overcoming. Not just cultural and ethical value. Cooperate. Here, the heroes there are a few. I talk at some length in the book about Dubois and his criticism of Booker T. Washington and vocationalism. Dubois, in the early 20th century, he wrote angrily about the insistence on the practical. He said, Americans today, this is about 1910, he said, Americans today have such an insistence on the practical that if Jesus Christ walked in the room, they'd call him a crank. If Socrates was here, they'd say he was a poser. 1910. The insistence on the practical. Dubois thought, I think rightly, that the insistence on the practical was not actually for people with money and position. It was for everybody else. And that is a leitmotif in American history. The practical is for people, and quite rightly in a way, I mean, people who are fearing that they don't have enough at all to get by with. But I'll focus not on I won't talk about them. I'll talk about Jane Addams. So Jane Addams, some of you know this story, and I should say, because there's got to be in a room of such smart people, there's probably a few American historians in the room, and I'm actually a European historian, so forgive me for any gross errors that have crept into my remarks. Jane Addams grew up in Illinois. Her father was a notable of sorts, I guess you'd say. He was prominent in the Republican Party politics in Illinois. He had some means. And Jane was a bright kid and an ambitious kid. She wanted to go to college. She'd done well in schools. And she said, I want to go to Smith, excuse me, and I want to become a doctor. And her dad said, no. You're a girl. It's not for you. You don't want it. Why do you want to become a doctor? You could have everything you need. And Jane said, I want to go to Smith. So he said, okay, go to this convent school, see how you do. So she's dutiful. She goes to the convent school. She does splendidly. She's on the newspaper. She gets great grades. She's a wonderful citizen of the school. And she comes back home. She says, Dad, I've done it. Now I get to go to Smith, and I want to become a doctor. You're still a girl. And Jane, you're kind of a nervous person. That's what they did late 19th century. You're a nervous person. You're a little fragile. I'm afraid to send you all the way out there to Massachusetts. And Jane was disappointed, to put it mildly. And then something quite extraordinary happened. He died, the dad. Just died. As a historian, we don't get that experiment very often. But, I spent most of my career writing about Sigmund Freud. And so I wasn't surprised, as some of the Jane Addams scholars seem to be, that, she doesn't go to Smith. She could. She got all the money. She could do whatever she wants. But, we Freudians say the most powerful father is a dead father. And in this case, it was true. So Jane says, I'm too fragile, I'm a girl, and I'll have my education the old-fashioned way. I also am very rich. So I'll go to Europe with some friends and do the grand tour and go and see things and read and learn and soak in the world. And she does. And she is a brilliant person, a gifted learner. And she's traipsing around Europe. And then one day, she's in London, and she's walking down the street, and she sees a guy just about to, and then step in front of a carriage. He gets knocked to the ground. He's seriously injured. And she says to herself, that's just like this poem of De Quincey's, who's citing a verse in Homer about the inability to react to tragedy when it's right there in front of you. And she's smart enough to realize that her education had undermined her character and ability to act. She says, in this lovely phrase, I think, she had lumbered her mind with literature. And so when something happened right near her, she couldn't even react to it. She reacted to a poem about not reacting to it. Good poems, but not reaction of the kind she thought was meritorious. She went home to the United States. She, as you know, went to Chicago and founded Hull House and created what we might call as community partnerships, right? Not service learning, really. She was even ahead of that. Community partnerships, because she thought, I have to learn from the people I'm here to be with, my fellow citizens, these immigrants who were her charges. And I have to learn how to make my education real in the world. And the only way to do that is to cooperate with others. Autonomy is overrated. Independence is overrated. Jane Addams, a great fan of hers, was John Dewey, kind of a hero of the book. And Dewey said that the American cultivation of independence and autonomy is a cultivation of pathology. It's a strange sickness which leads people to not be able to work together. Now, he said that in 17 chapters. Jane Addams is a beautiful writer. John Dewey, well, I think Oliver Wendell Holmes has said, right? He said, if God could speak, God would speak in the words of John Dewey. Pause. If God was inarticulate. Dewey had it all right, but the early pages, the early works, I think, take up 27 volumes. But what Dewey said, and what Jane Addams acted on, was this notion that truly engaged education was one that fostered the ability to cooperate. It set you free, but it didn't set you free to be alone. To be on your own, to stand on your own feet. It set you free, but it didn't set you free in an impoverished world. It set you free in a world that you can animate with your imagination and that you can then bring to the consciousness and full lives of other people. There's a lot of talk today about empathy and from neuroscience to ethics to animal studies, field that I hear about a lot. My wife's in this field. Jane Addams, in an essay called The Mountain Lear, talked about the relationship of education and empathy, which, as you can hear in that story I told you, right? That she didn't have empathy for the person being hit by the carriage. She went to the books. But she said in this essay, The Mountain Lear, that the problem with the cultivation of autonomy and independence in America is that we are cultivated to be autonomous in our individual silos, in our special spaces that don't interact with one another. So she says she calls this essay The Mountain Lear because she's writing about Pullman and the porter's strike, and then when Pullman could not understand and thought he had no business even trying to understand the point of view of these other people who had a different experience than him and had different interests than he did. Addams said, what is the point of education? And the lesson she thought of Lear was how tragic it becomes if we don't try to see the world from someone else's point of view. So she goes beyond Emerson, who said you should make the world alive. You should hear the music of the world, feel the special textures of the world. What Jane Addams adds to that is that, and then you should see if the guy next to you feels it. You should see what the people down the street, what keeps them from doing it. And then if you find what keeps them from doing it is they don't have enough to eat, well, then you're implicated by what you now know. You're not alone. You're not autonomous. Cooperation is part of what it means to live in a modern society. And that, of course, is Dewey's approach to education, is that learning should be learning through interrelationships, cooperation. Dewey said that the only way philosophy will recover itself, as he puts it in an essay around the time of the First World War, is when philosophers stop talking to philosophers about philosophical texts and start instead taking the tools of philosophy and applying those to the human problems, to translate the great methods and texts into the important questions that arouse our interest and concern and anguish and hope today. The isolation of education is not protecting education. It can doom education. I have plenty of colleagues at Wesleyan, and especially these days in the humanities, who are, circling the wagons, and they as I say about my friends at the richer institutions, they pull up the moat, the drawbridge over the moat, say, we'll be fine. We have a big endowment. We can support the Department of whatever you think is most beleaguered. Classics, philosophy, in some places history, all places foreign language. And the rich places say, well, we'll just pull up the drawbridge. And so we'll protect these people from the world. Seems to be exactly the wrong thing to do. We should take Dewey's and Jane Addams' approach and ask our scholars of deep knowledge in different fields to recover those disciplines by connecting them to things of moment now. I argue for a pragmatic liberal education. This is a book that really has as its theme the emergence of liberal education as the core of pragmatism. My teacher, one of my teachers at Princeton was Richard Rorty, from whom I take the last word of the four. We had liberate, animate, cooperate, and now instigate. Rorty said that the task of education at the college and university was to instigate students to rebel against the reigning orthodoxies or the status quo. In an era where the best-selling book on education is entitled Excellent Sheep. Excellent Sheep by William Deweys. I don't know how to say his last name. But that call for education as incitement, I think, is crucial. I don't know that if Bill Deweys, if he exaggerates the phenomenon. I know that at Yale he says when people start their first year in college coming from great schools like yours, when only one of 7 wants to be a consultant or a banker. And when they graduate, 7 of 10 or 8 of 10 want to become a consultant or a banker. The problem is not just that happens. The problem is that the university is proud of it. There lies the shame in the sector. I have a fundraising director who laughs about it and says, I want them all to be, 7 out of 10 is not enough. And we laugh. We laugh, too, about it. And once, giving this talk, someone came up to me afterwards and said, well, President Roth, that was very nice, very idealistic insight against the status quo when you're the president. Very paradoxical, actually, she said. And then she said, but it's the best defense of bourgeois values that I've heard. She said, because only people, or as another president said to me, only people who have a lot of money say that the money's not important. So please don't mistake me. I am not saying that money is unimportant. I am not imagining that people will have a liberal education so that they can go off and sit in a nice place like this and read books. I think with Dubois and with Walker and Jefferson and Addams that education has to be productive, it has to be pragmatic. With James, it has to be cash value in the ideas. But I don't, and I meet a lot of wealthy parents, thank goodness, but I've never met one who says, what I really want from my daughter is to make so much money that everybody else hates her, envies her. I never hear that. What I hear is, and I'm sure what you hear is, I want them to be happy. I worry that they will fall in a country that has more and more dramatic inequality, that they will fall into a life of vulnerability, and that the only choice is either vulnerability or wealth, that there's no middle, many people fear. But I never hear people say, I want my children to judge the content of their friendships and the value of their lives by the size of their paycheck. I don't think I will hear it. There are people who do it, we know that. But thank goodness, even in America today, they're ashamed of that. Or they know that that's a reason to go to the psychiatrist. Because in the end, it's not satisfying. So the kind of education I'm calling for is not an education for leisure and for meaning or for passion. The kind of education that I've been describing, that aims at freedom, that animates the world, that struggles for cooperation in order to incite change. I could have said, instead of instigation, I could have said innovation, and I would have been more popular, but I don't want to say innovation. Because it might not be so obviously productive. The things that are not so obviously productive have been the things, of course, that have changed our world. Revolutionized agriculture and transportation and communication, healthcare. We need innovation. We don't need drilling, even if you call it a coding academy. We need people who can code. We need people who can read. But we need them to be able to put those skills in the context of a broad and contextual education that can change the world, enrich their own lives, and foster cooperation. I'll tell you one last story, and then we can talk about whatever you'd like, after you give me a big round of applause. Last night we had this dinner with seniors, and a student said to me, she was doing theater, and I said, oh, really? Are you going to show this semester? I'd love to come see you. This is what we say, right? And she said, yeah, I am Sweeney Todd. I'm in Sweeney Todd, she said. And her friend said, she is Sweeney Todd, a female Sweeney Todd. I said, wow, that's great, a woman with a cleaver. I'll invite my mother. No. So I said to her, and she was clearly, happy to get noticed, right? And I said, well, you're a theater major. And she said, theater and molecular biology. And no one at the table, except me, showed any surprise. And we want an education where people will sit in that theater and they'll want her to be really good. This is the theater where In the Heights was born, the 92nd Street Theater. This is the theater that Lynn came back to and talked to students last year. She'll have to be really good. And in molecular biology, you don't get in a lab unless they think you can contribute to a publication. That's the dream of an education that's empowering, enlivening, and can contribute to our society. I think it's a dream worth holding on to. Thank you.